Can you hear me okay? Hello and welcome to my talk. I know it's the end of the day, but I hope you've had a wonderful conference day today. I hope you've had the chance to brush up on methodologies, compare notes, get inspired as UX professionals. And I also hope that you're feeling recharged and rejuvenated to go back to your good UX come what may battles. As UX professionals, I think we take user-centered design to heart. And for us, the user is quite literally above all. And in our mission for user advocacy, we many times become activists fighting the very teams that we engage with every day. We try really hard to hang on to this mission, and there's all kinds of chaos, challenges, constraints, teams that won't engage, less time, budget cuts, what have you. It is a tightrope walk, and it's a balancing act, and we're always balancing business goals and user goals. And we want to practice design in the right way. We want to respect discipline. We want to follow through with the design process and practice methodologies in a way that they are prescribed. And then our aspirations, right? We don't want to just make things pretty, nor do we want to just work on things that are designed to us. We want design to drive innovation. We want to leapfrog the value of design in our organizations. And irrespective of how far we are on that path to our aspirations, we stay focused on our tasks and revel in the fact that UX is so hot right now. But almost a lot of us here suffer from the secret pain. The pain of functioning with our arms tied behind our backs. Most companies, in most places, I'm sure you'll agree that we feel like second-hand citizens in our own teams, in our own projects and organizations, and many of us are still just trying to be heard. We are kind of burned out fighting those user advocacy battles. In many times, they're futile. So let's take a deep breath and acknowledge that you're not alone in this suffering. But let's also acknowledge that we are the problem, damn it. I understand that we have a lot of challenges and curveballs that our teams throw at us, but our main problem is this: obsessive compulsive design. So, if we are able to get a handle on this, then I think we can avoid some of that burnout and thrive in different organization cultures. And today in my talk, I'm going to give you a framework to control this OCD with another OCD, organization-centered design. Now, organization-centered design does not necessarily mean putting the organization over the user, or business over the user, or even balancing business and user goals. This one's a particular. What I mean by organization-centered design is a thoughtful design practice, or the design of your UX practice to suit the current state and needs of the organization. So to do that, let's first look at the field objectively. UX has come a long way. We ranked number 14 in the top 100 best paying jobs in America. We're very much in demand for projects that there are professionals, and our focus for some time now has shifted from just usability. We're talking about creating meaning and transformation in our customers' lives, etc. So we've come a long way, but I think that UX is still in an adolescent phase. We've come a long way, but we've not yet arrived. So most organizations across domains have UX teams now, which is awesome, right? However, most organizations also still do not realize what it takes to leverage the value of the teams that they have. So it's a constant uphill battle for user experience. And just like teenagers that are wrapped up in their own worlds, we too are wrapped up in our own worlds and are uncomfortable with any changes to our process. Now, when it comes to user experience design, a one-size-fits-all paradigm does not work. Similarly, a single gold standard for how we practice user experience, or the goals that we set up for ourselves as a UX team, irrespective of the type of organization that we are housed within, is also not practical. Now, as UX professionals, our design process revolves around the user. And very frequently, we also hope that the organization revolves around user experience, right? Unfortunately, it's more important to understand where UX fits in an organization. For example, is it an ad hoc function where it's more like an on-demand sort of a function? Or is it peripheral where the UX team may be working on surface level things or low-hanging fruit? Or maybe it's central to the organization, or perhaps even integral where design is the very fabric of how the business operates. In other words, what is the organization's maturity when it comes to user experience and how you recognize it? Now, there are lots of people who have been thinking about this, and there have been lots and lots of models. I could actually not fit all of them here, but there are many more. You can go check them out if you're interested. But for today's talk, I'm actually going to just use two models to support this framework for organization-centered design. The first one is a simple 2x2 matrix by Thomas Shatter. It was originally created to gauge the maturity of organizations towards UX research. However, I think it applies more generally as well. So there are two dimensions here. So there's organization buy-in, and there's the staffing that you need to actually do the UX function. And that creates 4 quadrants. Of course, everybody would love to work in organizations that are mature, where you both have the staffing and the buy-in. But the biggest opportunity, of course, is in the organizations that are approaching maturity, because there you have the buy-in, but maybe you're still ramping up with the staffing. I don't think we'll spend much time talking about immature organizations because there's neither buy-in nor staffing. So what that leaves us with is the organizations that are approaching immaturity. So just to complete that, these are organizations where you have staffing, but perhaps no buy-in or not enough buy-in anyway. And these are the organizations that cause that secret UX pain, right? And unfortunately, most organizations still do fall into this quadrant, into this bucket. So this model gives you a broad way to think about UX organization maturity, but I feel like these two dimensions are a little vague. So let's look at another model. And this one is by Timo Jokela, and it's called the dimensions of usability and user-centered design. Now in this one, there are 3 dimensions, and I think it progressively indicates a greater level of maturity for an organization. The first one is the infrastructure to do user-centered design. The second one is the impact of user-centered design on product development. And the third one is the impact on strategy. Now, but the model doesn't stop right there. It also gives you a scale from 0 to 5, borrowing from process planning and optimization, where 0 is incomplete and 5 is optimizing. So for any given organization, you can rank these 3 dimensions based on the scale. And that gives you a more fine-tuned way of thinking about UX maturity for an organization. If you combine the 2 models, interestingly, you can draw some parallels. It feels like the infrastructure corresponds to the staffing together with tools from the first model that we discussed. And the other 2 are buy-in. I think most of us in this room will probably still be more or less focused on product, impacting product development, whether it's a website application or a product, doesn't matter that. So I want to break that down further and say it's the extent of activities, user-centered design activities that you can do with access to real users, and more importantly, the extent to which you're able to apply the findings back into product development so that you can impact that product development. So this then gives you a really concrete way to break down maturity for an organization. And I'll refer to these attributes as I progress in my talk and how you can use that to help you out. A study by the Nielsen Group from 2006 says that an organization can take up to 6 or 7 years for an organization to even realize that they need a managed UX team. And it can take them up to 20 plus years before design becomes an important part of strategy. So let's assume that in the last decade or so, those timelines have somewhat collapsed, but the point really is that organization shift takes time. So keeping that in mind, let's look at the framework for organization-centered design. A pragmatic framework for org-centered design starts with a fundamental evaluation of whether you want to persevere in an organization fighting those UX battles or you want to move on. Assuming you want to stay, you need to objectively determine the type of UX role you can play in that organization successfully. And here's the important part, if you're okay with it. If not, back to point number one. Assuming you're okay with the role you can play in the organization, then carefully develop a set of UX team engagement strategies that will work for the organization that you are in, that is aligned with that organization culture, where you can then be successful. So let's go through these in detail. So the first one, if you're feeling trapped or burned out in your organization, you have to remind yourself that it is a choice. It's not an easy choice to make, but this is where you can fall back on some of those attributes that I just discussed when we were talking about the models. And that will help you understand whether it's worth staying in that organization or moving on. If you think about staffing, for instance, what is a reasonable amount of staffing for user experience? In organizations where user experience is a lot more important, and also maybe in organizations where the agile kind of environments are in place, you'll see ratios where you have one designer to say 4 developers. But the range from there goes upwards, and it can be one designer to 12 plus developers. That's when you start to think about, is this organization really committed to user experience? Is this organization serious about it, or even realistic about user experience, right? It's possible that there's a good reason for the higher ratio. Maybe the product is more back-end heavy and the larger ratio is okay, but that will have to be a conscious thing that you think about in order to determine. And it's one factor, but it is one of the factors that you can think about in order to make your decision. This is a relatively easy thing to wrap your head around staffing. The other dimension, which is assessing the buy-in for user experience, is often harder to glean, especially as an outsider, if you're interviewing for a job, for instance, things like that. Sometimes you do need those deep internal insights. One such fundamental indicator is leadership buy-in for user experience. Now, if that's what you're up against, anything else I say to you in this talk today is of not that much value. Jared School actually wrote a very interesting article called "Why I Can't Convince You Executives to Invest in User Experience in Native Tenure." I think it's sound advice. Executives cannot be convinced. They need to come to this on their own. However, executives are very interested in meeting their goals. And when their goals are impacted, then the whole organization responds cross-functionally. So it's important for us as user experience professionals to understand and connect our goals and contributions to those executive goals, business goals. I think the previous talk was a perfect segue to my talk, the previous talk in this room. So it's important to connect your goals to those leadership goals, and then if your leader is then convinced that your work is actually helping them achieve their goals, then the ability for you to expand your team, the activities, and therefore your impact is also that much more promising. Now I want to give you a quick case study here. So this is a year-long sketch of a product called UXPA Lift. UXPA is the commercial face of Drupal, and Dries Buytaert is the CTO of UXPA. And Dries, for those of you who may recognize the name, is the creator of Drupal. So UXPA creates products for Drupal from Drupal. And its main product offering is a developer platform to launch and manage Drupal websites. But the company wanted to expand the reach of Drupal beyond just the developers to personas like marketers and merchants. And they wanted to create an engagement platform called UXPA Lift. Now the concept of doing personalization from within the CMS was a very compelling competitive differentiator, and yet Lift suffered multiple rejections from the customer base in its early phase. UX research showed that it was simply too much for these non-technical personas to wrap their heads around these complex Drupal concepts and constructs. So we were reporting back to the organization that Drupal was the problem, that it was in the way. Dries told us that he would shut the product down if we threatened Drupal in any way. So we said, all right, we'll continue to make improvements to the current product. But we just didn't do that. We also selected carefully a set of metrics. Now, this was the organization's goal here, was they wanted to have these non-technical personas use Lyft in a plug-and-play model, right? So we chose metrics that pointed to that. Did they need assistance? How much time did they take? You know, things like that. The right kind of metrics that correlated with the company's goal. And we measured our improvements on a quarterly basis, and our mandate was to show quarterly positive trends for user experience. But when we chose our metrics, we also made sure those metrics were chosen in a manner that would show our leaders just the extent of improvements that we could do by simply improving the current UI, right? So this kind of a data-driven approach eventually let our leaders come to the conclusion that we indeed had to think outside the box, and we were able to dramatically pivot and add a layer of abstraction in a SaaS model. And so that leveraged the power of Drupal, but also allowed us to have this rich spatial interface where our less technical personas could then focus on their workflows. So this is a case study where we were able to influence product strategy and executive leadership. However, we very nearly lost our jobs doing that. And more importantly, I think we were able to do that because of two reasons. Our leaders recognized ultimately that how intimately user experience was linked to those business expansion goals. And even more importantly, we had come to a solution where we were able to not just address the needs of the user, but also uphold that core value of hardware being the Drupal champion. So, moving on to the next round in the org-centered design framework, UX team role. So before we can talk about the type of role that your team can play in an organization, I think it's important to understand how the organization perceives the value of user experience. If the organization is looking for low impacts, and they're probably looking for an indirect value, so they may be looking at user experience as an enabling function, how they enable other business critical functions achieve their goals. For instance, an on-time release, or a reduction in cost because of improvements in usability and reduction in support calls, for instance. On the other hand, organizations may also be looking for a high impact where they're thinking about user experience as a means of generating social sentiment, meaning and transformation in their customers' lives. And then they're measured in, like any other business critical function in terms of the impact that they have on revenue. So first, get a pulse for how your organization perceives the value of user experience. And then I think you can play one of three roles as a team. The first one is an advisory role. So for organizations that are completely new to user experience, maybe this is the only type of role that you can play. Sometimes it manifests where there's a crisis situation or a breakdown and an external consultant is hired, and then once that situation is managed, then it's back to being on their own. In other cases, you may have a UX team, but then their insight may be used in an optional manner. So these are all ways in which the advisory role may manifest in organizations that are more immature. But this kind of a role can also be called upon in more mature organizations where you may want to expand the bandwidth of user experience. So for instance, this does not necessarily mean there's a staffing issue or anything, but there's just so much demand that, and the business also recognizes what it takes to do user experience, and so you may have tiers of support. And for projects that are less important or lower in priority, maybe you only have an advisory role. This next one is probably the classic UX role, where you're brought in as an expert to solve interface problems or fix interface problems. This is actually, again, a spectrum, right? It can be anywhere from a tactical influence to a strategic influence. But no matter where you're on the scale, the important thing to remember is that in this type of role, you're basically influencing just the product interface, the digital interface, and nothing beyond that. So in organizations where UX plays a more peripheral role, you may be embedded in the product development team, and you may have your set of assigned features and functions. You may even be able to influence those features and functions to a large extent. However, your influence beyond those assigned tasks may be minimal or none at all. And it's also possible that the team is still cherry picking on your recommendations and things like that. Moving down the scale further, you may have organizations like Oracle or IBM, where you may have a large central UX organization or a large UX team or several large UX teams that are not just working on features and functions, but also on standardizing things like patterns and voice and tone, visual and design consistency, things like that. And these guys may also have a structured UX program where they may have, like I mentioned to you, the tiers of support, but also compliance, right? If they have those standards, there may be some level of compliance that they put into place. And they may have dedicated UX research labs, things like that. So there's a lot more investment. And at the end of the scale is when UX is able to, or UX function, whether it's research or design, is able to inform or drive product strategy and product vision. But like I said, just a reminder, we're still thinking about the digital interface here. And that's what distinguishes this role from the next one, where it's a strategic visionary role, where you're now able, the organization empowers you to think about beyond product experience into customer end-to-end experiences across touch points, and perhaps even thinks about design in terms of business strategy. Now, this is mostly in organizations that are either design-centered or at least design-sensitive. And you don't necessarily need to have a centralized UX structure, but you definitely need to have, for this role, a seat at the table at a leadership level and access to all business functions. So, I think it's important to sit down and think to ourselves exactly what is possible in our organizations, and then with those roles in mind, think about the team engagement strategies that will work for that organization. In presenting the strategies to you, I want to put these team engagement strategies on what I'm calling a UX team engagement strategy sliding scale. So the important thing here is that it's not any one strategy. You really have to kind of use a bunch. That's my point here. And on one end of the scale, you have strategies that teams can use where your organization may be engaging with you at a lower level. They're looking for more tactical impacts, things like that. And then on the other end, of course, the reverse, where the organization is really invested in user experience and is looking for strategic impacts. Now, when you look at the set of team engagement strategies here, you might look at it and say, oh, these things look pretty generic and commonplace, and indeed, many of them are. And many of you may have called upon some of these strategies in managing the scenarios that you're up against. However, I think this represents a capsule on a sliding scale that is very useful, especially for new user experience teams. And it's based on learnings from nearly 2 decades of working in very diverse organizations, giants like Oracle and Siemens, but also smaller companies like UXPA and Ipswich. So, in choosing the strategies that you want to employ in engaging with your stakeholders, you need to figure out how they align with the kind of buy-in that you're trying to achieve in your organization, or the kind of buy-in that you already have that will only let you use a certain level of engagement. So, said in another way, depending on the type of role that you're playing, you want to use a set of strategies that will allow you to slowly move the needle towards greater UX maturity for the organization, and therefore increase the impact that you have in the organization. And each of these strategies, many of them, and I can't say each of them, but many of them will also have different flavors depending on the type of role that you're playing, whether it is a peripheral role or a central role, a strategic role that you're playing in the organization. And I'll discuss each of these with you briefly. So the very first one, this is following orders, right? So for companies that are just beginning to work with user experience, they don't quite know what it takes to work with the UX folks. So this is the time to establish relationships, get your feet wet, focus more on establish trust before you become an agent of creative disruption, right? So this is where you have to focus on key wins over big UX wins. Moving the needle ever so slightly, I think in organizations where you are working on a set of design tasks, features and functions, things like that, begin to use your UX research and design validation to not just inform your designs, but to empower your team with that data to make decisions. Because they may still be making those decisions, they may still be making the calls for the direction that the team will take. And so the role that you're playing here is offering, educating, offering data, and raising the flag as it's necessary. This next one, setting expectations. This is one thing that I think most UX teams neglect to do, and it applies no matter what role you're playing or the majority of the organization when it comes to user experience. UX leaders often get really busy either evangelizing UX or getting creative in how to meet the expectations that the organization has on user experience. And again, depending on the maturity of the organization, those expectations may be realistic or not. And so, most of the time, UX teams are responding to an action plan. But remember that leaders in an organization are pursuing a vision, right? By the time that vision becomes an action plan, it's often being interpreted, translated, massaged, and you end up with a action plan that seems to be the easiest way to get to that goal, right? And then, depending on the extent of the maturity of the organization when it comes to user experience, UX is called to somehow make that be attainable, or at least make significant contributions so you can make that be attainable. So I want to give you another small case study here. Recently, my team was responsible, we were asked to respond to a growth goal of the company where we wanted to increase the market share for a product line. And the company's strategy to do that was by improving the buyer's journey for that product line. But the specific ask from my team was to help the development team improve the installation experience. Now going in, we knew that install is one part of the journey for a buyer, but we did as we were told, and our research though confirmed our thoughts and concerns, and we found a complex array of problems that surrounded the buyer's journey, from discovery to investigation on the website, to product packaging, licensing, activation, and what have you. So this was a little unusual, because usually what happens is user experience dreams big, and then the teams come back and tell us, no, we can only do this little sliver. But in this, we had a dangerous twist. The organization felt like we could make a big dent towards the goal of the growth goal by doing a small piece, but our research was indicating that we needed to do a lot more. So this was an interesting UX quandary. Damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? So if we did as we were told, then it would seem like we failed because we did not do enough to meet those growth goals. But on the other hand, the organization was not used to having UX research kind of like question or validate product strategy. But since walking into failure knowingly was not an option, we did the next best thing. So we took a yes and approach. So we said, all right, we'll focus our design on installation, but we will do our research that is much more all-encompassing. So we created a customer journey map, and we started to kind of be very transparent with our findings, and we put it on a wiki And we also made sure that all our findings were always connecting to that growth goal and how it would impact that growth goal. And more importantly, so what that was doing was raising flags. Remember, I already talked to you about that as one of the strategies. So we were raising flags even as we were learning, not waiting to finish all our learning and then present report, but even as we were learning, we were giving them those flags. And we were also doing another thing, because it was transparent, everybody had access to it, but we also made sure that the leaders were accessing that information. And so this is where having a dynamic UX leader helps, because sometimes you have to penetrate through those layers and sometimes red tape in order to do that. Another important thing that we did here was, like I said to you, we didn't wait to do a full readout after the customer journey map was ready and looked beautiful. But instead, we kind of did this on a weekly basis, where we were trying to make an impression over time, again and again and again. And because we were involving all the various business functions, both in informing the customer journey map and in designing our communications so they were viable, there was a buzz about the buyer's journey. The sales guys were talking about it, the marketing people were talking about it, and because of that buzz, our leaders began to pay more attention to that as well. And then our leaders were also beginning to acknowledge the fact that we needed to do our bit in the product, but there were other leaders that needed to hold their teams accountable to do their pieces as well in order to achieve this company goal. This was not a UX goal, this was not a product goal, this was a product line growth goal for the company, and so we needed to think about this more holistically. So for the first time, at least in this organization, a UX activity kind of spun off a truly cross-functional initiative. So, while setting expectations is important, I think the next thing I want to say though is that we can't be rigid in how we engage or what we propose. So this is where this next strategy comes in: advise but be flexible. Again, this I think applies more or less to any role that you play in all types of organizations. So as UX teams, I think we take user advocacy to heart, but even though we should persevere with our user advocacy, we need to be flexible. We need to understand the broader context of the business and what are the factors that go in, what are the technical constraints, and come up with alternatives that still move the user's agenda forward, but is helping the organization move forward as well. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how perfect your design is if you don't ship. So evolution is iterative and it can happen over time. Another problem that teams have with UX teams is that the design process becomes a bottleneck, a speed bump. And so sometimes they don't want to engage because of that. One of the reasons I think that is because we think that our design process is a set thing and this is how we need to do it. I think we need to get creative in expanding or collapsing our design process as well, depending on the maturity of the organization. And the other time when design can become a bottleneck is when design and development happens at the same time. Just before the talk, we were having a conversation about just this. But if you're able to have design lead development, then you have the time to think through before you start building. However, when you say design leads development, sometimes depending on the maturity of the organization, people start getting a little uneasy. So the only way that can work is when you take a collaborative approach and draw your stakeholders in so that they feel part of the process, and still you're taking the time to think before you build. If you are in a more mature organization too, even though those organizations may take factor in the time for the design process, you still need to be thinking about how you don't want to have them perceive design as a bottleneck. Design should be a mainstream way of thinking rather than something fancy that you do that takes time. All right. Setting UX specific goals, that's the next thing I want to talk about. So this applies more to organizations that are more mature, where they're tracking specifically UX goals. However, it doesn't matter if your organization is tracking that or not. I think it's a good idea to internally have some UX-specific goals and make sure that those goals are not conflicting with any other business function goals. I'm sure if you guys raise your hand, if this situation is applicable to you, there's a design mandate for consistency, but there's no corresponding priority in development. Instead, they have something all conflicting, where like crazy release timeline, and so your priority is gone out of the window. So you need to make sure that you're not chasing priorities that are conflicting with others. When organizations place goals for user experience, sometimes they can be very empty. Like I said, it can just be that UX function should not be a bottleneck to other people. Other times you have goals where you're measuring by the number of site visits, or the number of usability tests that you've done, and somehow it becomes bragging content and it's equated with quality. And I think it's important to reinforce to ourselves and to our organizations that it's not the amount of activities or artifacts that you create, but the time that you actually take to refactor your thought process based on those findings, and then measure how that effort paid off, right? So in other words, we want to express UX goals in terms of measurable business impacts, given the operational realities of the organization. Now I want to emphasize the latter part, because that's what makes it pragmatic, and that's where our idealism causes grief. So as passionate UXers, our natural inclination is to be like compasses, always pointing towards the North Star and wanting to head straight in that direction. However, the path to our North Star may be like a maze, it may be circuitous at best, blocked frequently, and many times you hit a dead end. So you need to ensure that you understand it's not an indicator of how good or bad you are as a designer, an influencer, or a negotiator. It also has to do with the organization's UX maturity. And as we have discussed before, organizations take time to mature. So if you're constantly trying to have goals, chase goals, where you're trying to have the organization become design-centered, then you're really setting up for heartache and measuring failure. Instead, I think we need to find ways to measure success, where we're able to then see how far we have helped the organization move the needle towards UX maturity. Now, it's often common to get fixated in terms of how far you have to go, but it's also good to sometimes look back and see how far you've come. Maybe it's much further along than you ever thought it was. Now, we also need to recognize that the needle can move forward and then fall back. Like in the ARPA case study that I discussed with you guys, it's not as if in that 1 year it felt like it moved the needle from end to end, but it's not as if the organization became design-centered quite in the same way as you would think of, say, an Apple during Steve Jobs' time. But wherever the needle fell back, it was further along than it was before. At this point, we are at a place in the sliding scale where we're not just doing user experience, we're moving beyond that and pushing the envelope to also be responsible for things like delight and innovation. And innovation, by definition, is out of bounds. So I think we need to become comfortable with the idea of coloring outside the lines, and that can mean different things based on the type of organization that you are. In an immature organization, it might just be that if you're working on a certain feature, but you might want to think about a flow that connects that feature to another feature. Or you might want to think about a yes-and approach, as I mentioned in my second case study, or a multi-pronged approach where you're working on a short-term approach and a longer-term approach in parallel. On the other hand, if you are in a more mature organization, then by all means, whether you're invited to or not, then expand your thinking beyond product interface into customer experiences and strategy, and see how your design thinking can serve each of those levels. So push the envelope. Another thing that UX teams neglect to do is we put in all our effort in producing such quality work, but we don't put in any effort in being effective in how we communicate it or making it visible. right? So I think that is absolutely important to do as well, not just in presentations and readouts, but in our cubicles, in our hallways,